Why did Lee Van Cleef utterly despise Eli Wallach? It's a question that's puzzled film buffs for years, especially those obsessed with Sergio Leone's iconic Western good, The Bad and the Ugly. To the average viewer, the chemistry between Van Cleef and Wallach on screen looked flawless, intense, electric, and perfectly tuned to the gritty universe of the film. But behind that iconic spaghetti Western grit was a real-life tension that no one expected. Lee Van Cleef, known for his cold-blooded stare and ruthless calm, wasn't the type to air his grievances. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, he was careful with his words. But those who worked close to him say that Van Cleef held a quiet grudge against Eli Wallach, the man who stole scene after scene with his manic, unpredictable energy. Some say it was jealousy. Others think it was deeper than that, something personal. You wouldn't know it watching the film. Wallach's tucko, wild-eyed and desperate, contrasted brilliantly with Van Cleef's composed and deadly angel eyes. The way they played off each other helped cement the film as one of the greatest westerns of all time. But when the camera stopped rolling, things weren't nearly as smooth. In fact, insiders believe the tension between the two men added to their performances, fueling the edge, the animosity, the sense of mistrust that the movie needed. Dig a little deeper, and the story becomes even more intriguing. Van Cleef was a former Navy man who had lived a hard life before becoming an actor. He wasn't interested in showmanship or Hollywood games. Wallach, on the other hand, was a classically trained method actor from New York who treated every film like a stage play. Where Van Cleef was private and composed, Wallach was loud, expressive, and always experimenting. The clash of styles may have been the real source of their feud. But it wasn't just about acting techniques. Over the years, stories emerged. Small comments and interviews, secondhand anecdotes, rumors passed along by film historians. It became clear that Van Cleef may have seen Wallach as more than just a co-star. He may have seen him as a rival, someone who stole the spotlight, who went off script, who turned a gritty Western into a platform for his own brilliance. And yet, the true root of Van Cleef's resentment might be something even more subtle, something viewers can only guess at, because Van Cleef never confronted Wallach publicly. He never made accusations, never complained. He just stayed quiet and kept his distance. What really happened between these two Western legends? To find the truth, we have to look beyond the dusty plains of their iconic film, because behind the cowboy hats and clenched jaws, a much more complicated story was playing out. And what happened next would change how fans saw both men forever. Before he was the cold-blooded angel eyes, Lee Van Cleef was just a man trying to survive in post-war America. Born in Somerville, New Jersey in 1925, Van Cleef didn't set out to become an actor. His early years were spent in the U.S. Navy during World War II, where he served with quiet dedication. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't showman. He was the type of guy who got the job done, quietly, effectively, and without complaint. That same steely resolve would later define the characters he played on screen. After the war, Van Cleef worked a series of blue-collar jobs. Painter, accountant, even a carpenter. One odd injury from those years stayed with him forever. He lost the tip of his middle finger while building a playhouse for his daughter. He never made a big deal out of it, and most fans never even noticed. But that detail alone said a lot about the man. He was practical, tough, and never interested in spotlight drama. His entry into Hollywood was almost accidental. Spotted by a talent scout during a stage production, Van Cleef was offered his first film role in High Noon 1952 as a silent gunslinger. He didn't have many lines, but his hawk-like features and piercing gaze did all the talking. He quickly became typecast as a villain, but instead of resisting it, Van Cleef leaned in. He perfected the art of saying everything with a look and nothing with words. Despite his growing filmography, Hollywood never treated him like a leading man. For years, he was relegated to background roles. Always a hitman, the outlaw, the mysterious gun for hire. It wasn't until Sergio Leone plucked him from relative obscurity for a few dollars more, 1965, that Van Cleef finally found a spotlight. His role as Colonel Mortimer showcased not just menace, but method, controlled, intelligent, and deeply personal. The world took notice. Suddenly, the guy with the villain's face had leading man charisma. Leone saw something in Van Cleef that others didn't, a quiet intensity. Unlike other actors who chewed the scenery, Van Cleef never overacted. He was all restraint and silence, and somehow that made him even more dangerous. When the good, the bad, and the ugly came around, Van Cleef was a natural choice for the bad. It was more than casting, it was destiny. But even as his fame rose, Van Cleef remained distant. He didn't mingle with Hollywood elites. He didn't chase interviews or seek attention. He preferred to let his roles speak for him. Fans adored the mystique, but colleagues sometimes found him hard to read. He could be kind, even generous, but always on his terms. And that distance, that emotional reserve, would become a key factor in how he related or failed to relate to co-stars like Eli Wallach. Van Cleef's journey from Navy sailor to Western icon wasn't smooth, and it certainly wasn't typical. But it shaped him into someone who didn't tolerate chaos, ego, or excess, which is exactly why working with someone like Wallach, flamboyant, unpredictable, and loud, would light a slow-burning fuse between them. If Lee Van Cleef was a quiet storm of the Western world, Eli Wallach was its lightning bolt, loud, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Born in Brooklyn in 1915 to Polish Jewish immigrant parents, Wallach was steeped in the energy of New York from the start. He studied at the University of Texas and then the prestigious neighborhood Playhouse School of Theater, eventually training under some of the most intense figures in the method acting world. He didn't just play characters, he became them. And when that style met the raw, dusty realism of a spaghetti western, it created something unforgettable. Tuco, the chaotic and cunning bandit in the good, the bad and the ugly, wasn't originally written as a star of the show, but Wallach made sure he was. From the moment he bursts onto the screen, yelling and flailing like a wild animal with a six-shooter, he grabs the audience by the collar and never lets go. He was bold, he was loud, and he was brilliant. But what made Wallach truly magnetic was how much of Tuco came from his own mind. He didn't just follow the script, he added layers. The dirty hat, the constant muttering, the religious quirks, like Tuco making little wooden crosses for his victims. All of it was Wallach's creation. He poured himself into the role with a chaotic energy that Leone couldn't resist. The director gave him room to play, and Wallach turned a greedy, violent outlaw into a strangely likable antihero. The contrast between him and Van Cleef was immediate and sharp. Where Van Cleef stood tall and still, Wallach twisted and turned, laughed and screamed. He filled the screen with movement, energy, and emotional noise. Tuco wasn't a villain or a hero. He was a desperate survivor, and Wallach made that chaos feel real. Every facial twitch, every line delivered with a half-smile or scream, it felt alive in a way most Westerns didn't dare try. But that same brilliance is exactly what may have put him at odds with Van Cleef. Wallach was expressive, improvisational, and emotionally open. Van Cleef was structured, restrained, and deeply private. Wallach saw the set as a creative playground. Van Cleef saw it as sacred ground that required discipline and control. The tension wasn't just personal, it was professional. Their entire approach to acting clashed. And yet, Wallach wasn't trying to steal the show, at least not on purpose. He was just being himself, a trained actor who couldn't turn off his instincts. He was beloved by crew members for his humor, always telling stories, pulling pranks, and lightening the mood. But to someone like Van Cleef, that might have come off as showboating or worse, disrespect. In later interviews, Wallach spoke fondly of the film, calling it one of his favorites. He even chuckled about how dangerous the filming was, casually mentioning that he nearly lost his life more than once. But one thing he rarely did was mention Van Cleef. And when he did, it was always in passing, usually with a grin that said more than words ever could. Because while Wallach may have charmed the audience, it was clear he never really charmed Van Cleef. Watching the good, the bad, and the ugly You'd think Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach had been lifelong rivals. Their scenes crackle with tension. The way Angel Eyes calmly sizes up Tuco's manic energy. It feels too real to be just acting. And that's because, in many ways, it wasn't. The set of Sergio Leone's masterpiece was chaotic, raw, and often dangerous. Filming in the deserts of Spain during scorching heat. With a multilingual crew and barely any safety regulations, tensions naturally ran high. But it wasn't just the environment that made things unpredictable, it was a cast. Each actor brought a wildly different energy, and no two clashed harder than Van Cleef and Wallach. Leone was the kind of director who thrived on contrast. He loved throwing opposites together to see what sparks would fly. In that sense, casting Van Cleef and Wallach was genius. One was stone-faced precision, the other theatrical chaos. When they shared scenes, something almost magical happened, like two storms colliding. The friction made the film better, but it didn't mean the two actors enjoyed it. Behind the scenes, there wasn't much camaraderie. Wallach was known for his offbeat humor and casual storytelling. He'd often break into wild impersonations or improvise lines on the spot just to get a laugh from the crew. He thrived in that kind of creative anarchy. Van Cleef, by contrast, was all business. He arrived on time, hit his marks, and went home. He didn't joke around. He didn't play games. He took the work seriously and expected others to do the same. There are stories from the set that hint at this tension. Crew members recalled how Van Cleef kept to himself during breaks, while Wallach joked with extras and played cards. One Italian assistant director even said Van Cleef never smiled unless the camera was rolling. Wallach, meanwhile, seemed to live for the chaos. He once told a story about nearly being decapitated during a stunt, laughing it off like it was just another day at work. But the most telling moments come from their own words. In a rare interview, Van Cleef admitted that Tuco was the only character in the film who had real emotional depth. It sounded like a compliment, until you read between the lines. There's a tinge of resentment there, like he knew Wallach had been given a meteor role, the one with all the flavor, while he was left with a hollow shell of menace. Even Leone seemed to favor Wallach's improvisation. He often let Tuco run wild in scenes, while keeping Van Cleef's character rigid and controlled. That imbalance was brilliant on screen, but it left Van Cleef looking like the side character in a film where he was supposed to be one of the stars. To audiences, their dynamic felt electric, but to Van Cleef, it may have felt like erosion. Scene by scene, take by take, Wallach's unpredictability chipped away at the control Van Cleef valued most. And while the film would go on to become a classic, the relationship between the bad and the ugly would never warm up, only simmer quietly beneath the surface. And that simmer was about to boil over. The tension between Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach wasn't just a result of clashing personalities. It had flashpoints, specific moments during filming where the divide between them started to harden into something colder. And while neither man ever went public with accusations or stories, those who observed them on set and fans who studied their body language in interviews have pointed to a few key moments that may have pushed things too far. One of the biggest sparks? Screen time. Despite being billed as a three-way story, the good, the bad, and the ugly clearly gives Wallach the most room to shine. Tuco gets backstory, humor, emotional breakdowns, and redemption arcs. Angel Eyes? He's lethal, yes, but also one note. Van Cleef's role was stripped down to pure menace, with very little room for emotional nuance. For an actor who'd waited his whole life to be recognized as more than a background villain, that had to sting. Then there was the issue of improvisation. Wallach frequently went off script, adding quirks, muttering under his breath, reacting with wild facial expressions that weren't in the screenplay. Leone loved it. He encouraged it. But for Van Cleef, who preferred discipline and precision, this made scenes harder. Timing got thrown off. Blocking changed. And every time Wallach stole a scene with another unpredictable outburst, Van Cleef's tight, restrained style looked even more muted by comparison. Crew members later hinted at the growing gap. Wallach, always the entertainer, would pull people aside during setups and joke about Van Cleef's silence. "He's probably counting how many lines I have again," he once quipped, grinning. It was a harmless jab to most, but if Van Cleef overheard comments like that, it likely only reinforced his feeling that Wallach didn't respect the work, the balance, or him. There was also the issue of stunts. Wallach famously did many of his own, sometimes recklessly. In one now infamous moment, during the scene where Tuco's hands are tied and he's balancing on a noose, a misstep nearly cost him his life when a horse spooked and took off with him still hanging. Van Cleef, ever the stoic, reportedly said nothing as the crew rushed to save Wallach. Not even a word of concern. That kind of coldness didn't go unnoticed. And then there's the biggest theory of all. Van Cleef saw Wallach as a threat, not just his screen time, but to his legacy. Van Cleef had waited decades for a role that would define him. After, for a few dollars more, he was supposed to be the star. But Tuco stole the spotlight, and audiences walked away quoting Wallach, not Van Cleef. That kind of overshadowing doesn't sit well with a man who built his entire career on being noticed, even in silence. What started as professional distance began to feel like something personal. No arguments, no outbursts, just a slow freezing of whatever connection they might have had. On screen, they shared scenes. Off screen, they barely shared eye contact. And if you thought that was the peak of the tension, what happened after filming would raise even more eyebrows. When the good, the bad, and the ugly wrapped filming in 1966, most of the cast went their separate ways. There was no grand celebration, no photo op goodbye. But what followed was even more telling. Absolute silence between Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach. Over the years, Wallach became a frequent guest on talk shows and retrospectives. He'd laugh about the filming process, share wild stories about Sergio Leone, and even talk about Clint Eastwood with a certain fondness. But when the name Lee Van Cleef came up, something shifted. Wallach never insulted him, never attacked him. He simply moved on. Quick mentions, vague compliments, no real stories. That kind of silence is rarely accidental, especially from a man like Wallach, who had no filter and loved spinning a good tale. It wasn't that he didn't have anything to say. It's that whatever he had to say, he chose not to. And Van Cleef? He was even quieter. He rarely gave interviews. But in the few that surfaced, his words about Wallach were clinical at best. A talented performer, he once said, without a smile. Nothing more. Fans and film historians started to take note. On convention panels and in interviews, Van Cleef would happily talk about Eastwood or Leone. But Wallach? He was a closed book. Some even speculated that Van Cleef blamed him for the way audiences remembered the film. In many fan polls, Tuco is voted the most memorable character, by far. And while Angel Eyes is terrifying, he's never quite the favorite. Then came the documentaries. When Wallach was interviewed for a spaghetti western retrospective in the 1980s, he was asked if he kept in touch with Van Cleef. Wallach just raised an eyebrow and said, "We weren't the letter-writing type." No laugh, no follow-up, just that. And in that moment, viewers could sense it. Whatever existed between them wasn't just distance. It was deliberate. Some even point to specific lines in later interviews that hint at deeper bitterness. Wallach once joked that during filming, everyone had to work hard, except one guy who liked to just stand there and squint. On the surface, it's funny, but the tone? It was sharp, maybe even a little bitter. Was he talking about Eastwood? Or was that a thinly veiled jab at Van Cleef's reserve, calculated acting? On the flip side, Van Cleef never cracked jokes about Wallach. Not because he didn't have them, but because that wasn't his style. If he didn't like someone, he didn't insult them. He erased them. The coldness wasn't in what he said. It was in what he refused to say. When Van Cleef passed away in 1989, Wallach gave a short statement. He was a part of something great. That's how I'll remember him. It sounded respectful, but distant. No warmth. No anecdotes. Just a line that felt more like obligation than tribute. It's possible that Van Cleef never hated Wallach in the loud, dramatic way most rivalries unfold. His hate, if you could call it that, was quieter, a kind of permanent frost, a refusal to acknowledge, to connect, to pretend. And that silence, that's what made the whole thing so haunting. By the time both men had passed, Van Cleef in 1989, Wallach in 2014, their characters had already been etched into cinematic legend. The good, the bad, and the ugly wasn't just a Western. It was a turning point in film history. It redefined how antiheroes could dominate a story, how silence could speak louder than dialogue, and how rivalry, both scripted and unscripted, could drive a narrative. But what made that film endure wasn't just the dusty landscapes or Ennio Morricone's haunting score. It was the strange, crackling energy between the characters. And now, looking back, it's impossible to separate that tension from what was happening behind the scenes. Van Cleef and Wallach never went to war, not in the open. There were no public fallouts, no dramatic tell-alls. Instead, theirs was a Cold War, quiet, simmering, and endlessly fascinating to those who look closely enough. It's there in the way Angel Eyes watches Tuco like he's studying an animal. It's there in how Van Cleef delivers his lines, measured sharp, like each word is being carved from stone. And it's there in Wallach's performance, too, like he's constantly trying to steal focus from the still figure in black, just out of frame. That tension became part of the film's DNA. Leone may not have intended for it to feel so personal, but that's exactly what happened. Viewers picked sides. Some loved Tuco's wild unpredictability. Others respected Angel Eyes' cold efficiency. But almost everyone sensed that those scenes weren't just acting. They were battles, subtle, controlled, and deeply real. And the legacy didn't end with the film. For decades after, their dynamic influenced how rivalries were portrayed in media. The emotionally chaotic character versus the silent, calculating one. It became a blueprint for countless duos in film and television, but few ever matched the raw authenticity of Wallach and Van Cleef. Because their rivalry wasn't written, it was lived. Even film scholars and biographers have had to tiptoe around the relationship. There are no love letters, no angry exchanges, just a mutual freeze-out that never thawed. The deeper you look, the more obvious it becomes. There was something unresolved there. Not just a difference in style, but a fundamental clash of identity, ego, and presence. Van Cleef never sought the spotlight. He earned it one cold stare at a time. Wallach, on the other hand, took it by storm. And in that divide, something broke. Not enough to destroy the film, but just enough to leave a scar. Ironically, that scar may be what helped make the good, the bad, and the ugly so legendary. Because real tension always leaves a mark. And in this case, it was burned right into the celluloid. For fans, that unspoken feud became part of the mythology, a reminder that sometimes the greatest performances come from places of discomfort, of quiet competition, of unresolved energy that never quite finds peace.